This is All of It. I'm Allison Stewart, live from the WNYC studios in Soho. Thanks for sharing part of your day with us. I'm really grateful that you're here. On today's show, we'll celebrate the start of Pride Month with a conversation about some must-read books. And we'll hear selections from our recent Get Lit with All of It book club event with author Tom Perrotta and the band They Might Be Giants. That's the plan. So let's get this started with a birthday celebration for a Hollywood icon. On this day, 100 years ago, Marilyn Monroe was born. The story of how a little girl named Norma Jean Baker transformed from a poor foster child into a Hollywood bombshell seemed like the ultimate example of the American dream. Of course, we know that came with a dark side. Monroe died at 36 of what police called a, quote, self-administered overdose of sedative drugs. A new book titled I Want to Be Loved by You, Marilyn Monroe, A Life in 100 Takes by Andrew Wilson draws on an extensive archives of interviews and documents to explore every aspect of Marilyn Monroe's life and career. Through 100 quick chapters, the book tells the story of Monroe's ambition, her constant desire for self-improvement, and her dashed dreams of becoming a mom. So on this day, which would have been Marilyn Monroe's 100th birthday, we're going to spend some time learning more about her life with author Andrew Wilson. I Want to Be Loved by You will be published tomorrow. Andrew, thanks for joining us.
Hi there.
Listeners, we'd like to get you in on this conversation. What is your favorite Marilyn Monroe performance? What memories do you have of her movies? Maybe you have a question about Marilyn for biographer Andrew Wilson. We are talking about Marilyn Monroe on her 100th birthday. Our phone number is 212-433-9692, 212-433-WNYC. You can call in and join the conversation, or you can text that number as well. When was the first time you became aware of Marilyn Monroe?
Probably like many people, being a bit bored, a bit lonely as a child, switching on the TV and seeing this extraordinary actor light up the screen. And I just looked at her and I thought, this is such an unusual actor. And I just wanted to know more about her. Little did I know then that I would go on to write a biography about her.
A lot has been written about Marilyn Monroe throughout her life, some of it false. What is a question you still had about her that you wanted to investigate in this book?
Well, there's been so many myths, as you say, so many falsehoods. And what's happened over the years is the fact that people have repeated the same stories. So I wanted to get to the bottom of these conspiracy theories, because basically that's what they are. And I devote the last fifth of the book trying to uncover the true circumstances around her death. And I trace the conspiracy theories back to 1964 with the publication of a pamphlet called The Strange Death of Marilyn Monroe. And in that, Frank Capel, the author of this pamphlet, he tried to link the death of Marilyn Monroe with Robert Kennedy. And because this is repeated and repeated to the point where it's basically become fact for so many people. I mean, if you ask lots of people, how did Marilyn die? They will say, wasn't she killed by the Kennedys? So that's one of the central questions I wanted to ask. And basically, I sort of found and traced the source of this conspiracy theory back to a group of sort of right-wing cabal who tried to smear Robert Kennedy so he would not become the next president of the United States.
Yeah, you had access to all kinds of documents and recorded interview, thanks to Marilyn Monroe's biographer, Anthony Summers. Some of the things that you came across weren't published yet. What surprised you in these documents and tapes?
Well, just listening to these voices, these kind of ghostly voices, because as you say, Anthony Summers interviewed something like 650 people in the 1980s, and the vast majority of these tapes had never been published before. So he gave me sort of unprecedented access to this treasure trove of material. So listening to people like Jane Russell and Billy Wilder talk about Marilyn in this way, listening to this kind of crackle and this sizzle of the tape. And they talk about her, obviously, they knew her incredibly well. And she was an incredibly complex person. And that's the thing I really wanted to uncover. Because I think people have either seen her as a victim or a feminist heroine. And I think there's so many shades of ambiguity and subtlety in between.
Is it true that Marilyn Monroe wrote her own autobiography?
She did. So this was back in the 50s, and she was talking about subjects such as sexual abuse and mental illness. Now, you've got to remember, this is decades before the Me Too movement, decades before Epstein's scandal, when people did not talk about these subjects openly. She was a Hollywood star controlled by the Hollywood studio system. So where she talked about these subjects, it was an incredibly radical, subversive thing to do. And I think that's one of the reasons why she remains so popular today, is because she strikes a chord with sort of a modern sensibility.
She could be elastic, we'll say, with the truth a little bit. She could
She
kind
could well be, yes. So that was also one of the challenges, to try to sift between some of the stories that Marilyn spun for herself. We know that she had a very difficult childhood. She never had a stable home. And one of the things people told me is the fact that nobody read her stories as a child. So she had to come up with her own. So she often lived in a fantasy world. As a child, took herself off to the movie theatre, and spent hours dreaming about becoming a star.
Today would have been the 100th birthday of Marilyn Monroe. We're talking about her life and career with Andrew Wilson, author of the new book, I Want to Be Loved by You, Marilyn Monroe, A Life in 100 Takes. The book will be out tomorrow. Listeners, what questions or memories do you have about Marilyn Monroe, her favorite performance? Give us a call, 212-433-9692, 212-433-WNYC. Let's talk to Steve, who's calling from Airmont. Hi, Steve. Thanks for calling. All of it. You're on the air.
Hey, Allison. You are awesome, and I love when they say, "What a great question." Sure. Anyway, the movie, and I'm just curious. Maybe it's you cover it in the book, sir. Don't bother to knock. All right.
Yes.
And it's not a lot of, doesn't get a lot of attention. But it is one of the archetypal, I think it's the archetype for all the nanny movies, the deranged nanny movies that have been made since. And it's a hotel movie. Anne Bancroft, a young Anne Bancroft, has a supporting role as Richard Widmark's girlfriend, the lounge singer. And it's a hotel movie. It's a deranged nanny movie. And it was just awesome. And you don't hear a lot of people talk about it when they discuss her. It was a dramatic role, and I thought she was great.
Thanks so much for calling. I believe it's on page 80. You right about that, Andrew?
Yes, I do. I think it's a wonderful film. And it really shows the potential Marilyn had as a dramatic actress. Because obviously, we sort of more or less sort of think of her as a wonderful comedic actress. But her range was incredibly broad, I would say. And also, it's interesting that she drew on her own experiences of suffering from mental health difficulties with that role, because obviously, as Steve says, she plays the role of a mentally unstable babysitter. And she kind of thought back to some of her own experiences to make that performance incredibly realistic.
This says, amidst all her glamour and Hollywood sparkle, please remember that Marilyn Monroe challenged systemic inequality through her fight for equal pay, her support for civil rights and racial integration, and her efforts to subvert the patriarchal Hollywood structures. Phil sent that in to us. Is this what you found as well?
That's interesting, isn't it? Because I think she did in a very quietly subversive way. She was friends with Ella Fitzgerald. She supported her when Ella was finding it difficult to fill houses or perform in what I should say are white only spaces. She sent her support. And also, she was a great civil rights supporter, and also a supporter of LGBT rights. Many of her close friends were gay. So she was across the spectrum, and she was very interested in left-wing politics as well.
It's interesting, your book, for people who don't know, it's 100 different takes on Marilyn Monroe, hence the name, A Life in 100 Takes. It's 100 chapters. Some of them are very short and they tackle quick subjects like her blonde hair or her relationship with religion. Why did you want to structure the book this way?
So, in addition to the unpublished archival material, which gives the book its meat, if you like, I wanted the reader to experience Marilyn's life in a new way because we've had so many biographies, traditional biographies, and I wanted her life story to be told in a way, a series of sort of takes you'd get from a film. So this is a kind of kaleidoscopic structure. So with each turn of the kaleidoscope, we might see a different aspect of Marilyn's very complex character.
It's interesting. We got this text, and I know you can answer this question. It says, so curious about Marilyn's sexuality since she was abused as a young girl. I'm curious how that impacted her intimate relationships. You write that at 8 years old, she suffered sexual abuse and a man she calls Mr. Kimmel. It's been debated in biographies for decades. How did some form of childhood trauma inform Marilyn's relationships?
Yes, it's a very difficult subject, but a key one for Marilyn's psychology. And of course, she wasn't believed about this at the time, and many, particularly men, dismissed this as a fabrication. But I completely believe this happened. She wrote about it with great sensitivity and feeling. And I think she thought, and certainly her psychiatrist and analyst thought, that she was always trying to sort of find a way out of this abusive cycle. And it's very difficult to sort of understand the complexity of her psychology. But I think she was always sort of seeking an ideal partner, not finding one, searching for, the pinnacle of masculinity. I'm not saying this always happens with people who've suffered abuse, but she often would call her husband's daddy or pa. So, it's a very kind of unsettling difficulty that Marilyn had. But I think it's something that haunted her even towards the end of her life. She was talking to strangers about this issue, and she always thought that she'd survived this much. She knew something like this could drive other people, in her words, psychotic. And she was a real survivor.
When did Norma Jean become Marilyn Monroe?
So it's a gradual process, I think, but basically, she transformed herself, first of all, through modeling. And then she was named, of course. She was obviously never born Marilyn Monroe. But interestingly, here's a sort of a New York connection. When the person who came up with her name at the studio, he was sort of looking for a name, and he was called Ben Lyne. He was the head of casting at 20th Century Fox. And he was sort of like thinking about her first name, and he named her after the Broadway star Marilyn Miller. So that's kind of one of the New York connections. There's lots of other ones, obviously, because she lived in New York and loved New York. But she was definitely fascinated by this process of transformation, and it was a self-consciously complex transformation from Norma Jean to Marilyn. And it was an image constructed with the use of acting techniques. She studied physiognomy, the muscles in the body. The sexy walk we think of as typically Marilyn was rehearsed and rehearsed and rehearsed. The color of her hair was changed. She sought out the colorist who colored Jean Harlow's hair, because she wanted that kind of white platinum blonde look. So it was a process that went on for a number of years until she thought she'd perfected it.
You write in your book, she may have been shy, particularly early in her career, but Marilyn could also be determined, ambitious, and at times ruthless. When was she ruthless?
Well, she would have what we now call agency. I think. So, she wanted to, she wanted to matter. She wanted to be valued. So, for instance, there's one quite funny story that when she was in Some Like It Hot, and I think one of the girls in the band, the jazz band, she spotted this woman dyeing her hair in a similar kind of shade of blonde, and she had her dismissed or had her put to one side because, as Marilyn said, she was the blonde, the only blonde.
We are talking about a new book. It's called I Want to Be Loved by You, Marilyn Monroe, A Life in 100 Takes. Today would have been Marilyn Monroe's 100th birthday. We'll continue. There's more, all of it, and more Marilyn Monroe after the break. You're listening to All of It on WNYC. I'm Allison Stewart. Today would have been the 100th birthday of Hollywood star Marilyn Monroe. We're talking about her life and career with Andrew Wilson, author of the new book, I Want to Be Loved by You, Marilyn Monroe, A Life in 100 Takes. And listeners, what questions or memories do you have about the life of Marilyn Monroe? Give us a call at 212-433-9692, 212-433-WNYC. You can call in or you can text us. This says, as a child, I first saw her on TV in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes and loved it. As an adult, Some Like It Hot is still hilarious, but when I was little, I stood over subway grids trying to recreate the scene in The 7-Year Itch. This text says, the movie channel has some of our movies in regular rotation. I vote for Niagara. Andrew, 1953 was a huge year for her career. Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, Niagara, How to Marry a Millionaire. How did this year change the future of her career?
Yes, as you say, 1953 was her breakthrough year. So before then, she'd had a number of good but minor parts. She'd been in All About Eve, Asphalt Jungle, but suddenly, 1953, three huge blockbuster films. And, she was on the front cover of Life magazine, and people began to associate her mostly with sex. So you can imagine, in 1953, post-war America is still a very conventional atmosphere, a conventional place. It was the boom of consumerism, but people were still very, very uptight about sex. It's a very, very different age. So Marilyn comes in, just watch that kind of scene in Niagara where she's walking in that sexy way. From the courthouse to the bell tower, which was then considered to be the longest walk in movie history, swinging her hips. And it was an extraordinary kind of presence. She was sizzling, she was dazzling, she was sparkling, and she was quite dangerous, I think, for lots of people. So some people loved her, but then some people were kind of morally outraged by her presence. But she was a star from that moment onwards.
Let's hear a clip from Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. This is Marilyn Monroe as Lorelei trying on a tiara, except she doesn't know what a tiara is.
You might be interested in my tiara. I always carry it with me, afraid to leave it in the stateroom.
And you're not afraid to show it to Lorelei?
Now stop. Lady Beekman won't know you're teasing. Look. Did you ever, anywhere, anything like it?
All blue stones. Cozy little job, what?
May I just hold it for a minute?
Of course.
How do you put it around your neck?
You don't, Lovey. It goes on your head.
You must think I was born yesterday.
Well, sometimes there's just no other possible explanation.
No, my dear, she's quite right. Like so. It's a tiara.
You do wear it on your head. I just love finding new places to wear diamonds.
Marilyn Monroe, she kind of represented occasionally an archetype, and it was a source of real insecurity for her. She wanted to improve her education and to prove her intelligence. What did the people who knew her have to say about her intellect?
Well, of course, she was a high school dropout. She left school at 16, and she felt that very keenly. because she always sort of felt slightly ignorant in company with other people who were sort of well read. But she did not let that stand in her way. So when she was becoming an actor, she also took herself off to, UCLA, where she went to night school to learn about literature. And she started to read voraciously. She was 21 when she read Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams. And when she died, she left behind a huge collection of books, classics, literature, philosophy, plays, texts that you'd think, oh, why would Marilyn Monroe have these? And, she was sort of written off when, there's that famous photo of by Eve Arnold with Marilyn reading Ulysses. And at the time, people dismissed it and thought it was a publicity stunt. What's this dumb blonde reading this difficult text? How can she? But, she really, really engaged with literature and philosophy. And of course, I think that's one of the reasons why she ended up marrying Arthur Miller.
Let's take a call. This is Heather calling from the Upper West Side. Hi, Heather. Thanks for taking the time to call all of it. We want to hear about your relationship with Marilyn Monroe.
Yes. Well, unfortunately, I never met her, but I was obsessed with her as a child. And I've called you before. My husband was Tony Randall, and he made the movie Let's Make Love with her in 1960. She was still married to Arthur Miller. So, of course, I asked him many questions. He valued people being professional very, very highly, and she would show up routinely 8 and 9 hours late to the set, and he would get extremely frustrated. He would threaten to come in at 5 p.m. when she came in, and they said, if you do that, you'll be fired. And so his frustration was really intense. She couldn't come out of the trailer, and she would have so much trouble on set. But he had a really interesting theory that I like to go with because, to your earlier point, it gives her agency, if this was correct. His theory was that when she was a young starlet, she was being paid $100 a month on contract. And even when she became a megastar, she was still on that contract. And they would sell her to other studios and pocket the money. Mm-hmm. And so his theory was that she was giving it back to them, that she was screwing them for all the years that they'd screwed her. And I like that rather than say she was a drug addict or mentally ill, because that gives her agency. So that's pretty much what he said. He didn't have a lot to do with her other than directly on set.
Thank you so much for calling, Heather. We appreciate this. Does this make sense to you, Andrew?
I think it's interesting, isn't it? I think by that point, I think she did feel a certain level of bitterness. Other people were being paid huge amounts of money, and she was still on a relatively low contract. I think that's the reasons why in 1955 she formed Marilyn Monroe Productions. Only the second woman in Hollywood to form her own production company, to give her greater power within this patriarchal industry controlled by men. So I think she always felt, the economic uncertainty and differences very, very keenly. But of course, by that point in her life, she was getting involved in taking more and more prescription drugs, barbiturates, and finding it difficult to sleep, in which case she would have then something in the morning which would affect her mood. So she was in a very kind of difficult vicious circle when it came to prescription medication.
Yeah, she had endometriosis, is that right?
She did. And I think in my book I talk about how I think that was probably the origin story for these drugs, these prescription drugs, because she was in a huge amount of pain. And she started to take them as painkillers and as sleeping pills because, back in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, the treatment for endometriosis was basically non-existent. It was not like it is today. And even today, there were problems with it. So she was suffering from this condition, finding it very difficult. And I think that's also sometimes would affect her mood and affect her ability to turn up on set on time.
We've talked a little bit about her death, but what was going on in her life right before she died?
right before she died. Well, of course, she sang Happy Birthday, Mr. President in May 1962 at Madison Square Gardens in New York, one of the most famous clips in sort of popular movie history. So many people link her last few months with the fact that she was having a relationship with JFK. And I sort of devote a couple of chapters to this to get to the heart of it. And I think there is some truth in the fact that they did have a relationship. Now, when it comes to this idea that she wanted to be First Lady, that she was going to try to, get into the White House, that she was going to call a press conference because she was then rejected, all that, I'm afraid, is, as far as I can see, without any evidence whatsoever. Similarly, when it comes to her relationship with Robert Kennedy, I go to the heart of that conspiracy and show how that conspiracy started. And I think they were very good friends. I think she admired him for his left-wing views, his policies, and she was fascinated by him, but she did not find him physically attractive.
The book is called I Want to Be Loved by You, Marilyn Monroe, A Life in 100 Takes. It is out tomorrow. My guest has been Andrew Wilson. Thank you for taking the time today.
Thank you.